Welcome, everyone. Today we have Dr. Diekema, who is a professor of pediatrics at UW with adjunct appointments in the departments of bioethics and humanities and internal medicine in the School of Medicine and the Department of Health Services in the School of Public Health. He's an attending physician in the emergency department at Seattle Children's Hospital and serves as Director of Education for the Truman Katz Center for Pediatric Bioethics at Seattle Children's Hospital. He's been a member of the Seattle Children's Hospital Ethics Committee since 1991, has served as ethics consultant since 1993, and has been chairperson of the Institutional Review Board since 2000. He is past chair of the Committee on Bioethics of the American Academy of Pediatrics and is a member of the Ethics Committee of the American Board of Pediatrics. Dr. Diekema, the author of numerous scholarly publications in medical ethics and pediatric emergency medicine, and is an editor of Clinical Ethics in Pediatrics, a case-based textbook. Dr. Diekema.
Thank you and good afternoon, and probably more importantly, happy spring. I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm more than ready. What I'm going to talk about today is the adolescent brain and some of the I'm going to draw from a number of disciplinary work from different fields and sort of provide a clinically useful way, I think, of thinking about how adolescents make decisions based on what we know about their brains. And I come at this interest primarily from my bioethics work, and I'll talk a little bit about that as I work through the talk, because we have always sort of traditionally thought about adolescent decision-making in a certain way, and my feeling as time goes by is that the way the ethics realm has thought about adolescent decision-making and when they should be allowed to make decisions, for example, is probably a flawed one. And I think this has implications in a lot of different arenas, including criminal justice and risk assessment and sort of injury prevention. So I'm going to start with a couple of cases that I will come back to as we talk through this, and then provide a fairly general overview of our understanding of the adolescent brain, and I'll apologize right now for doing that for those of you who happen to be neurobiologists. This is going to be overly simplistic. For those of you who are clinicians, you'll appreciate it. And then talk about some of the implications of what we know. So the first case I want to talk about is that of Dakotah Eliason. Some of you may have read Dakotah's story in the New Yorker about a year ago. Dakotah was a 14-year-old. His friend had recently committed suicide. His girlfriend had recently dumped him. And he saw that breakup as a sign that he would always be a failure. Nobody would miss him after he was gone. So he was sitting in his room one day with a handgun thinking about committing suicide and sat there for quite an extended period of time considering the possibility. So he had his grandfather's loaded .38 caliber pistol in his bedroom. He was sitting there trying to decide whether to kill himself. And then he walked into the living room. He saw his grandfather sleeping on the couch. He stared at him for another 45 minutes, debating what to do next. And then he shot him and killed him for no good reason. He loved his grandfather. It was an impulsive act. His grandmother came down the stairs. They called the police, and Dakotah ended up in the criminal justice system. Another somewhat different story is about 13-year-old Daniel Hauser, who is a young man who lives in Sleepy Eye, Minnesota. He was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease at 13, given approximately a prognosis of about 90% chance of cure with treatment, standard treatment. And he had his first round of chemo, which not surprisingly made him feel really crappy. And so he came to the conclusion that because the chemo made him crappy, it was toxic. He's obviously right about that. And it wasn't good for him. At the same time, he became a medicine man and a church elder in something called the Nimanaha, which is an American Indian religious organization. My understanding is the way you become a medicine man in this organization is you send $35 to somebody and they send you a certificate saying you're a medicine man. So it at least if my understanding is correct, it does not require any sort of elaborate ritual or any learning. So Daniel claimed that further treatment would violate his religious beliefs. Again, that chemotherapy is self-destructive and poisonous, and he wanted to pursue an alternative regime that consisted of complementary medicine techniques like dietary changes and ionized water. And he went as far as to say, I'd fight them if they made me take the chemotherapy again, I'd punch them, and I'd kick them. And so the question then is, can Daniel Hauser make this sort of a decision? His court ended up in the district court where it was very clear that he didn't believe he was currently ill, largely because the chemotherapy, after it made him sick, had actually probably put his cancer into remission, and so he wasn't all that sick anymore. Based on the judge's examination of Daniel, he didn't feel he had an understanding of the risks and benefits of chemo. He felt he was not a mature minor, and I'll talk about the mature minor doctrine in a minute. And so the judge ordered him to report for a chest X-ray and select an oncologist, and said you have to agree with treatment if the oncologist says further treatment is indicated, and if you refuse, we'll put you in temporary custody. So the way Daniel Hauser's case evolved was that his mom took him, put him in the car, and headed for the Mexican border. And I'll talk about how that case got resolved in a minute. So the first question I want to address is whether the adolescent really has any decision-making authority. And many of you are sort of familiar with the laws surrounding this. William Blake says, neither youth nor childhood is folly or incapacity. Some children are fools, and so are some old men, which we know to be true. There are many adults we're familiar with that make really stupid decisions about all kinds of things, including the one in the picture. My family is taking the photo, not on the ride, including my adolescent children. So the question of capacity comes up, and I'm not talking about competence here, I'm talking about capacity, whether adolescents have the capability of making decisions. Now, we have this legal structure in place that allows us to treat adolescents in emergency situations without parental consent, as long as what we're treating them for is truly an emergency. We have emancipated minor laws, which allow adolescents to meet certain conditions, which are actually quite difficult to meet. The reality is many of the emancipated minor laws, to get emancipated, you pretty much have to be very close to being an adult. It includes things like being married, and most states have a lower age limit on when you can be married, being in the military, and again, you can't be in the military until you're at adult age in many states, and those sorts of things. So emancipation is a pretty high bar. And then we have these condition-specific exceptions, which many of you are familiar with. In Washington State, for example, as you all know, if you have a psychiatric disorder, and I believe the age is 13 and above, or 14 and above, it's one of those, you can consent to psychiatric treatment, which presumably includes substance abuse treatment and anything related to psychiatric care. You can also consent to treatment of sexually transmitted diseases, pregnancy-related care, and so on as an adolescent in Washington State. Now, one of the important things to recognize about this particular carve-out in the law, many people sort of lump this with the emancipated minor law, and that's a mistake, because these are public health exceptions. In other words, these exceptions were not created because somebody said, if you're mature enough to get pregnant at age 13, you ought to be mature enough to consent to care. These were created because of the recognition that adolescents will get STDs and they will get pregnant, and if they're afraid to involve their parents, they won't get the care they need to take care of them. So these are public health exceptions. They're not exceptions based on anybody's notion that somehow a 14-year-old would really be competent to make that sort of a decision. And then we have mature minor laws, which are probably the most variable from state to state, and the variability often comes in whether there's a lower age limit and whether a judge has to make this determination or a physician can make this determination. I'm a little unclear on even after talking to our legal counsel about this, as to exactly what Washington State says. There are some who believe Washington State's law actually gives the physician the right to make this determination. In other words, if you have a patient in an office and you feel they're mature enough to make this decision, you can allow them to do so. But there are others that think it requires a judicial determination. And the gist of this particular carve-out is an individual one, rather than taking a group of kids, like those who are married, or a group of adolescents. This has to be made on an individual basis, based on that individual's ability to understand the nature, purpose, and consequences of proposed treatment. So when Daniel Hauser's case moved to the district court in Minnesota, that judge was tasked with deciding if Daniel, as an individual, really had the sort of adult-like capacity to make a fairly complicated medical decision about cancer care. Now, so the problem with that, so that's our sort of legal structure. And the problem with adolescent decision-making, and what I will tell you is that the ethics structure around this has almost always been to sort of look at approximately the age of 14, make the argument that above 14, decision-making ability looks an awful lot like adults, and therefore the sort of default position should be that 14-year-olds should, unless you've got evidence to the contrary, should be given a great deal of latitude in making decisions. And that's what I want to challenge. Because one of the things we know is that adolescents often don't perform at a level commensurate with their cognitive abilities. So the basis for this, particularly the bioethics world stance on this, is really a single study done by Lois Wheathorn about 30 years ago. And from a methodologic perspective, it's a very nice study. I mean, it was very rigorously done, and it involved taking adolescents, having them do very complex medically related decision-making tasks. And she took various ages. I think she used 12 and 14 and probably 16 and then 21 or something like that. And what she found was you couldn't tell the 16-year-olds apart from the 21-year-olds in terms of the way they came to decisions, how they made decisions, and so on. The 14-year-olds also were fairly indistinguishable from adults. The 12-year-olds were easily distinguishable. And so that's where we sort of get this 14-year-old division. Now, what Wheathorn's study really showed us was that adolescents have the capacity above about the age of 14. They actually have the mechanics, the brain mechanics, to make adult-like decisions. But the problem is what we find in other studies, as well as most of us in real life interacting with adolescents, is that they often don't use it. And they use it less frequently than adults do. And it seems to be really tied to sort of what's going on in their lives and in the context of the decision. And bear in mind that when Lois Wheathorn does a study like this, just like when most psychologists and neurobiologists and so on do studies like this, it's a classroom setting in which they're asking adolescents to do this task. In other words, it's not you have cancer now and you have to make this decision. It's you're sitting in a room with a pen and a pencil and we ask you to do this task and tell us how you think you'd decide in a theoretical sort of way. A very different decision-making task than when you've just told an adolescent, for example, they have cancer. We know that middle adolescents are more likely than younger adolescents to rely on analytic processing, but that it's not their primary means of decision-making. And again, this is what's important, because Lois Wheathorn gave them a task that engaged their analytic processing. But we know that particularly younger and middle-aged adolescents, like 15, 16-year-olds, use a different kind of decision-making as their primary mode. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So, in other words, these kids, probably 14 above, actually have the ability to make adult-level decisions, but they don't always use that ability, and they frequently don't use it in the sorts of situations that, if we allow them to make the decision, they can actually make a very bad decision for themselves. So let's talk about that adolescent brain a minute. This has been covered recently in a lot of the popular press. National Geographic did a nice cover story on this a few years back, summarizing some of the research that's been done on this. And as I mentioned, the recent research comes from a lot of different realms. So it's actually difficult to for people in one discipline to actually know about it, because you've got neurobiologists and anatomists on one in one discipline working on this, and psychiatrists in another, and adolescent specialists in another, and one of the nice things and one of the beautiful things about this area is that it actually is all saying the same thing. In other words, it's pretty consistent with each other, and it's really interesting to pull all that research in, look at it, and realize that it's all pointing sort of in the same direction. So here's the overly simplistic way of thinking about this. What we know about humans in general is that we have, and again, this is overly simplistic, but we basically have two brain systems when it comes to decision making. And one of them is what I'll call the rational brain system, which is or you could call it the analytic system, which is largely sort of based anatomically in the prefrontal cortex. This is the system you're all aware of when you make decisions. This is the one you think you're using when you decide to walk in to the Apple store and buy an iPad. This is sort of what you're conscious of. In addition to that, though, we have a system comprised largely of the limbic structures and the ventral striatum, which we'll call the emotional system. And this is the part of our brains that we're not as consciously aware of. In other words, there's not sort of a conscious analytic process that's going on here. It motivates our behavior largely by the way we feel about something. And the reality is, this is the part of the brain that makes you buy the iPad. When you walk into the Apple Store is a brilliant design for taking advantage of the way our brains really work, because you're not very conscious of this emotional system. And so good marketers know, I mean, there's a reason a good commercial has cute puppies or babies in it. Good marketers know that the way to get your attention and the way to get you to feel warm and fuzzy about something is to engage this emotional part of your brain, not the rational part. So you can walk into an Apple store and have already decided rationally that you have no use for an iPad. I have an iPhone, I've got a laptop. What does this thing do that I'm not already capable of doing? And then you walk into the store and they're right there and they're beautiful, and you can touch them and pick them up and caress them and fall in love with them all within about 5 minutes. And then the helpful Apple guy comes over and you suddenly have walked out of the store with a $700 thing that you had decided beforehand you really didn't have any use for. That's really the emotional part of the brain. That's also that's the part that the car dealer tries to take advantage of when you walk in and he tries to sell you a car. He tries to get you not to think about this rationally. So one of the lessons here is that we all use both of these parts of our brain when we make decisions. The emotional system is thought to be adaptive. If you think about this from an evolutionary biology perspective, this is thought to be the system that's most adaptive for living in small groups. It's very responsive to other people. It's the social parts of our brain. It explains why being part of the peer group is so important to adolescents. It's really important to most of us, but it's really important to adolescents. And it's because this part of the brain is really engaged in what other people think and being compliant with the peer group and so on and so on. If everybody else has an iPad, you need one too. So this is like the Scarecrow and the Tin Man, right? The Scarecrow is caring but brainless. He's got that big emotional part. And the Tin Man is cerebral but needs a heart and has that sort of cerebral part. And I'm absolutely sure that they had no idea that these two parts of the brain existed when they wrote The Wizard of Oz. So what does the emotional brain do? It picks up on patterns before we're consciously aware of them. It motivates behavior by changing our feelings and autonomic responses. It's that part of the brain that gives us first impressions. You meet somebody, you immediately decide if you like this person or not. That's not a rational decision. That's often based on sort of an emotional first slice, thin slice read of your brain that's done at a very subconscious level. I mean, you're often not aware of what actually it is that's making you like or not like this person. It's just something that you feel. That's not to say that there isn't some very complex analytics going on somewhere. It's just to say it's happening very subconsciously somewhere. What does the prefrontal cortex do, or that rational part of the brain? Well, this does what you think it does. It does that high-level reasoning, decision-making, impulse control, the assessment of consequences, planning, strategizing, organizing, inhibiting inappropriate behavior, adjusting behavior when a situation changes, setting priorities, estimating, and understanding probabilities. And we all engage this periodically, not all the time, but this is what the prefrontal cortex does. This is the part of our brain that makes us decide that maybe driving 80 miles per hour on I-5 isn't a good idea. And so we don't do it, even though it might feel good to drive 80 on I-5. Not that it's possible to drive 80 on I-5 through Seattle. but if you could. We also have case studies, historical case studies, that sort of, if nothing else, illustrate the importance of both of these parts of the brain. One of the things I don't want you to take away from this is that somehow what I'm calling the rational part of the brain is more important than the emotional part of the brain, because we know from studies of individuals who have had impairments of those emotional brain structures that their decision making is just as impaired as somebody who has damage to the prefrontal cortex, for example. And a man named Phineas Gage is a great example of this. The story of Phineas Gage was one that was fairly well known. He was basically a construction worker who lived about 100 years ago and was in the process of building a building and was tamping down some gunpowder with a metal rod when the gunpowder exploded and sent the rod basically through his brain, as you see there. Now, what was known about Phineas Gage until maybe 10 years ago was that his behavior completely changed. He somehow survived this injury, despite the rudimentary medical care available to him at the turn of the century. But his friends all said, Phineas just isn't Phineas anymore. There's something wrong with him. And he was actually capable of doing sort of analytic processing and so on, but his decision-making was absolutely abysmal, and he had no impulse control, and his social interactions completely changed. People didn't want to be around him. He was unpleasant to be around. 10 or 15 years ago, because we have Phineas Gage's skull, there was a neurobiologist reconstructed where this rod went and made the determination that it wiped out many of these sort of limbic areas, leaving his prefrontal cortex intact. And the implication was that these structures, the loss of these structures actually had radically impaired his ability to function in society in any kind of a reasonable way, even though his prefrontal cortex was still there. So both of these parts of the brain are really important. Now, what we know about adolescent brain development is they're in the process of getting to a point where both of these are in good balance, basically. And we used to think that brain development was largely done by age 3 or 4. That, you know, the brain obviously changes enormously between birth and 3 or 4 years of age. And we used to think that was pretty much settled at that point, and there wasn't much you could do about it. What we now realize is that there's a second period of very significant change and growth that occurs in the adolescent period. And that change largely involves remodeling, pruning, increasing linkages between the corpus callosum to connect the two sides of the brain, stronger links between the hippocampus, which is where memory is stored, and the frontal areas where goals and agendas are created. In other words, sort of improving the connections between these various parts of the brain. You may say the emotional and the decision-making parts of the brain, or the rational part of the brain. There's also increased myelinization and so on. So we know the brain is changing very, very rapidly. And we also know that the impact of these changes is that we get better at balancing impulses, desires, goals, self-interest, rules, ethics. We get better at integrating our memories and experience into decision-making. We get better at planning, and we get better at improving the balance between immediate rewards, it feels good to drive fast on I-5, and future consequences, that may not be good for me if I want to live past the age of 20. So the other thing we know about adolescent brain development, and this is important beyond sort of what we have declared to be legally adulthood, because the reality is that we know the brain is not fully matured until the mid to late 20s. In other words, 25-year-olds are actually more adolescent than they are adult, particularly 25-year-old males, because as it turns out, male brain development falls about 2 years behind female brain development. I see all the women in the audience chuckling, because you know this is true. We also know that maturation occurs front to back, or back to front rather, so that it's actually the emotional, those sort of limbic structures, that emotional part of the brain matures before the last part of the brain, which is up here, the prefrontal cortex. So it's that sort of rational part of the brain that's the last one to mature. which means that during these adolescent years, you actually have an imbalance. You've got a mature, emotional decision-making portion and an immature, rational decision-making portion. And you can guess which one is going to win a lot of the time. It's going to be the one that's matured and fully ready to go. And so what really makes adolescent decision-making different is that this imbalance exists. So it's not that they can't engage the rational part of the brain. It's just that the stronger, more sort of innate part of decision-making for them is the emotional one. And that's what they tend to rely on, particularly in certain situations. And again, this goes on into the mid to late 20s. So, one way to think about this is if you're engaging your prefrontal cortex and you're faced with a situation, the prefrontal cortex will cause you to stop, make an assessment of what's going on, make a plan, and then proceed. One of my other areas of interest is wilderness medicine and survival, and we see this in wilderness medicine and survival all the time. People who tend to do fine if they get lost or get into trouble when they're out hiking or in the woods are the people who engage the rational part of their brain. They stop, they think, they make a plan, and they proceed. The people who get in trouble are the ones who let emotions overwhelm them and don't stop and think. They get in a situation, they have an emotion or a feeling, which in that setting is usually, I got to get out of here because I'm in trouble, and then they react. And they frequently will do something really stupid, like run off a cliff or try to cross a river that they end up drowning in or something like that. And so these two structures work very differently. That's not to say the limbic system structure isn't very useful in certain settings. I was hiking in Southern California several years ago, and in total la-la land, thinking about something else, not paying attention to what I was doing or where I was walking, and I suddenly found myself, without any conscious awareness of why, doing probably the longest long jump of my life. So I'm in mid-stride, and suddenly I'm doing this huge leap. It was only when I turned around and looked that I realized there was a coiled rattlesnake on the trail. I would not have been able to answer the question, why did you just jump, until I turned around and saw the rattlesnake. The limbic portion of my brain did some pattern recognition and immediately reacted based on that. And that structure is it is the one that gets engaged in situations like that. It's very reactionary. It occurs at a subconscious level. And anybody who's been in that situation knows it's fairly remarkable. I've also been in a situation where I almost got run over by a car on Balfour Way, and found myself experiencing what people talk about, time slows down, and I did this sort of roll out of the way of the tire, and then got up and continued running across the street. None of that was conscious. It was all very subconscious. It wasn't that my brain was going, okay, what do I do next here to survive? It was just sort of an automatic, immediate response. That's the limbic system that's acting. It has very great value in situations like that. So the way Lawrence Steinberg puts it is the adolescent brain is a well-developed accelerator, but only a partly developed brake. It's very responsive to immediate rewards. Why is that? So there are several reasons that you actually want a system like this. You don't want adolescents to necessarily have a fully mature brain. Because once myelination is complete and connections are established, that slows down learning and the brain becomes less nimble and adaptable. So you actually want a period of development where the brain is like this. In other words, if we completed development earlier, we'd be dumber. And that's really the way to think about this. I've also had the chance to talk about some of this work with an evolutionary biologist who had a very interesting perspective on this. And what he said to me was, if you think about this from an evolutionary perspective, several hundred years ago, we didn't live in big cities like Seattle. We lived in small communities, and we were very dependent on those social interconnections. He said, and if you think about that, you actually want adolescents in your tribe because you're living in a dangerous place. You've got this small group of people, and there are enemies out there. There's saber-toothed tigers, and there are other tribes that want your stuff. And he said, you really can't send the 50-year-olds out to sort of scope out the area. For one thing, the 50-year-olds aren't dumb enough to do that. So what you want is adolescents who are risk takers, and the thrill of the search is, they're going to be willing to go out there, take some risks, come back and tell you sort of what's going on out there and what the dangers are and what you should do. They're also going to be the first ones to grab the spears when the saber-toothed tiger threatens the tribe. So from a small community perspective, these adolescents are actually important. There is a reason, actually, that most of our soldiers fall into this age range, you know, this sort of 18 to 29-year-old age range, because once you get sort of beyond that period, you're much less likely to take the sorts of risks you may need soldiers to be able to take. It also, though, probably explains why we see so much psychological trauma from these young men when they come back from places like Afghanistan and Iraq, because this is all happening at a time where their brains are still developing and very susceptible to the traumatic damage that may be done to the developing brain in a way that a 30 or 40-year-old may not be. So that's just to say that this is not a maladaptive system. It is actually an adaptive system, but we have to be careful that we appreciate the fact that adolescents don't have fully developed brains. What they have is probably what we could call a form of prefrontal cortex deficit disorder. This explains why many adolescents can be a little impulsive, inflexible, aggressive, reckless, emotionally volatile, take risks that maybe adults wouldn't be as inclined to take. They're reactive to stress. Any of you who have adolescents at home have seen all of this stuff, right? They're vulnerable to peer pressure. They respond to short-term rewards much more powerfully than long-term rewards. They underestimate long-term consequences. They overlook alternatives. I have a very rational 17-year-old daughter at home, but boy, all of this stuff can really set her off. I mean, she can tell us that she's going to have to spend her whole weekend studying for the SATs and making sure she gets A's. But if a party with her friends pops up, that will take priority, despite what she's just told us about needing to study all weekend. And it's that sort of peer pressure, the short-term reward and the long-term consequences tend to lead her to make decisions that may be different than she would make if she were 30 years old. So in summary, what we have with the adolescent brain is an imbalance between development of the prefrontal cortex and the subcortical areas. That makes adolescents very sensitive to environmental cues, affective elements, rewards and punishments. It also explains why they tend to take risks, why they seek thrills. And what we need to realize is that while their brains are actually very good, in many ways just as good as ours at decision-making tasks, they're not very good at making decision-making tasks in certain situations, like high-stress situations, emotionally charged situations, situations where peer pressure may play a fairly significant role, and decisions where immediate rewards are being played off against long-term rewards or long-term consequences. And again, any of you who have adolescents at home have learned this, right? I mean, the worst time to try to reason with your adolescent is when they're angry and upset and yelling. The best thing to do is just to stop, let them cool down. What I found with my daughter is that she frequently comes out of her room 30 minutes later and has a solution to the problem, because she's in what's happened in the room is that the emotional tension has tamped down, and it's allowed her to re-engage that rational part of her brain and come up with a solution. She's gotten past the fact that she's upset that she can't use my car tonight, and then, now that she's calmed down, she's found a friend who can take her where she needs to go. So that's sort of what happens with adolescents. So they're capable of making rational decisions, but they're less likely to do so under certain circumstances, and they're more likely to act impulsively without a full consideration of consequences, and act on sort of gut. And the external influences here are really powerful, and the big one we all know about is peer pressure. One of my favorite studies is one that involved computerized risk-taking tests. Now, what they did in this particular study, and I still don't have a good picture of how you do this, but they put people on an MRI machine and then somehow had them driving a car on a screen. And I don't know what this thing looked like to be able to do that, but so you give them a driving task. And when you do this with adults, and by adults I mean people who are basically over 30, the first step is you do this without anybody else in the room. So the adult is driving, and they do so fairly safely, and what you find on the fMRI scanner, these are functional MRI scanners, is that the prefrontal cortex is what lights up. which suggests at any rate that they're primarily using their prefrontal cortex in making driving decisions. You take a group of adolescents and have them do exactly the same thing. The adolescents also drive fairly safely, and it's their prefrontal cortex that lights up. Now you repeat the experiment, only this time you take a couple of that person's friends and put them in the room with instructions that they're not to say anything, they're just to sit there and watch. The adults don't change their behavior. They continue to drive fairly safely, and their prefrontal cortex lights up on the fMRI scanner. The adolescents suddenly drive completely differently. They're driving more recklessly, they're taking more risks, and the fMRI scanner looks different this time around. It's not their prefrontal cortex that's lighting up, it's these limbic structures that are lighting up. It's what some people refer to as the reward centers of the brain, because they're getting an immediate reward by taking these risks in front of friends. And so peer pressure really does, it changes the way these kids make decisions and where they make them in their brain. So I want to tell you a story about how I watched this play out. This occurred several years ago. I, at the time, had just completed a study looking at 10 years of data of every child who had died doing a wilderness activity in Northwest Washington. The stories were fairly compelling because most of them involved some degree of risk-taking in the adolescent population. So I'm hiking on Mount Sauk, which is a nice hike. It's not too rigorous. If you hike this as an adult, you won't think anything of it. I realized this trail wasn't exactly what I thought it was the first time I took my 3-year-old daughter on this trail, and realized this trail is actually riskier than I thought it was. Because as it turns out, this trail, which actually if you stay on the trail is quite safe, but it switchbacks frequently, and the reason it's switchbacking is that at the end of every switchback you're pretty much at a cliff that could result in a fairly nasty fall if you get off the cliff. And you realize that when you're hiking with a 3-year-old, because you suddenly realize, good night, she could careen right off this thing. But I was hiking this trail one day and was probably 2 or 3 switchbacks from the top. And maybe one level up were 4 adolescents, 2 boys and 2 girls, probably about 15, 16 years of age. We're literally, less than a quarter mile from the top of the hike. And so I'm sort of at one switchback where it turns back from the cliff, and they're 1 or 2 above me, and I'm watching them because they have stopped at the end of the switchback, and I can see them talking and looking at each other, and it's very clear that they're discussing getting into the scree field, which ends in this cliff, and just going up the shortcut instead of following the trail. And I'm thinking, not a good idea. It's a fairly steep scree field, the footing is bad, and you don't have to slide very far before you end up in a place where you're not going to stop. And I then watched the 2 boys hop out onto the scree and just start scrambling up. And the 2 girls stop and look at each other. So here's that boy-girl difference, right? The 2 girls have about 2 years more brain development going on, and they know this isn't a good idea, and you can tell by the way they're looking at each other that they know this is not a good idea. And without a word being said between the 2 of them, they just look at each other for about 5 seconds. One of them just turns around, looks at the boys, and then hops out onto the scree field and follows them up. And the other one is just frozen. And at that point, I was close enough to say something to her, which was probably, in retrospect, not a good idea, because I'm an adult. And I said, if you just stay on the trail, you'll probably get there as fast as your friends do. And at that point, she hopped onto the scree and headed out. And three steps later, slipped and started sliding down. And she got up a pretty good head of speed before she snagged a piece of clothes on a branch or something and stopped. And she stopped right by where she'd started, at the switchback where she'd started, and I thought she was going to hop on the trail. She headed right back up the scree. She looked at me, and then she headed right back up the scree. It's a classic example of adolescent decision-making. Those were not smart decisions on the part of any of them, but in particular on the part of the girl who almost killed herself and still made a bad decision after doing that. But these are emotionally based decisions, and she was unable to, her rational part of her brain was trying to engage, but it couldn't overpower those limbic structures that were telling her your friends are going to think you're a wimp if you don't go up. And that was too strong an influence for her, even after she'd had this pretty close call. And that's pretty classic adolescent decision making. And, you know, it explains in part why when we look at recreational injuries and deaths, overwhelmingly the high-risk groups are the adolescent age groups. And it doesn't stop at 19, as I mentioned earlier. It usually extends to 24 or 25, where we see these, what actually are fairly enormous increases in risk compared to other age groups. And you can see it goes down once you move away from that into adulthood to much lower levels. And it's not just that, you know, it's not just that rates of activity change at these age groups. It's actually that their willingness to take risk changes. And this is what we found in my study looking at deaths. You can see that it's overwhelmingly this 15 to 19-year-old age group. I didn't look above 19 when I did this study, but and you can also see that there's a huge male preponderance here. There were 40 deaths, and I think 36 of them occurred in adolescents. There's a guy named Dan Meyer who's created a wilderness accident matrix where he has looked at many wilderness accidents and come to the conclusion that most of them aren't actually accidents, that they're preventable if only you had determined ahead of time that the conditions were unsafe to do what you're doing, or not engaged in an unsafe act, or made an error in judgment. And the reality is we know that adolescents are at risk for all three of these things. They're less inclined to judge unsafe conditions. They are prone to unsafe acts because of this sort of risk-taking propensity, and they make errors in judgment in part because of the way they make decisions. Meyer actually, in his scheme, actually has adolescent age group as one of his things under unsafe acts. He considers adolescence to be an unsafe act, believe it or not. So what are the implications? So there are clearly implications for injury prevention here. Teen risk assessment is different. We need to recognize that. It does not help very much. I won't say it doesn't help at all, but it doesn't help very much to lecture to adolescents about what's safe and what's not safe. It doesn't help necessarily to enroll them in courses because it engages the rational part of the brain without recognizing that these decisions ultimately will be made at an emotional level. So what we have found is that overwhelmingly the things that make the most difference for adolescents in terms of their death rates, if we look at driving, for example, are structural and legal barriers to allowing them to do these behaviors, as opposed to trying to teach them, you know, requiring driver's ed courses, trying to teach safe driving. What we've learned over time is that doesn't seem to work. But what does work is graduated driver's licenses. That has had an impact on death rates, as have the state laws that restrict an adolescent's ability to have peers in the car. That's also made a huge difference. Washington State's law is flawed in that it allows it much too soon without an adult in the car as well. So what we as clinicians as well as parents need to recognize is that setting these barriers can be more important actually than just telling an adolescent to be careful or to drive safely, because that may not make a difference when they find themselves with peers. And of course, if you add alcohol to that group, or firearms, or some other high-risk thing, it just increases the problem. If you think back to Dakotah Eliason, the one thing that would have prevented that tragedy is if Dakotah had not had access to a loaded handgun that was in his grandfather's home. A lockbox would have solved the problem. He would not have shot his grandfather. He didn't want to shoot his grandfather. This was an impulsive decision that was driven largely by sort of his emotional state at the time. He clearly didn't engage his rational brain, and he did something that he lived to regret, as well as everybody else in that family. Not having access to that gun would have made all the difference for Dakotah Eliason at his age. There are also implications for criminal justice, because I think one of the big questions, and psychiatrists are frequently engaged in these discussions and sometimes engaged as to speak to courts, to testify in court trials. I think there's a legitimate question to ask as to whether somebody like Dakotah Eliason really can be tried as an adult, given the way they make decisions at that age. In other words, it's hard to make the argument that because he did this at 14, he's going to be unsafe to society at 28 or 29. He made an impulsive decision. He's using a sort of decision-making modality that won't exist 10 years from now, or at least will be different 10 years from now. And judges and juries should probably consider that sort of factor when they sentence people like Dakotah Eliason. And state laws maybe should be changed to take this sort of thing into consideration. That's not to say there aren't psychopathic 15-year-olds who will remain psychopaths, but Dakotah Eliason pretty clearly wasn't somebody like that. And one of the things we've found is that that's true of many of these sorts of tragedies. There are also implications, I think, for adolescent decision-making and what kinds of decisions we let adolescents make. I do think we need to show adolescents respect. We know that they are capable of engaging very adult-level decision-making, so they should be involved in discussions and decisions. We should recognize their developing capacity and allow them to make decisions because the practice is important when making those decisions will not harm them in important ways. But we need to recognize that even 17, and because this is an audience that takes care of adults as well, I would argue until the mid to late 20s, we should recognize that their decision-making, their primary mode of decision-making, particularly in certain conditions, may be different than it will be past the age of 28 or 29. And that may lead to flawed decision-making. And there are ways that we as clinicians can deal with that. One is if you see somebody making what looks like a bad decision, and it looks like things like peer pressure or the emotion of the situation is driving it, it's probably better to revisit that decision without those variables intact. If a 25-year-old, for example, refuses chemotherapy, that's a discussion I'm not going to just leave simply because they're an adult who decided to refuse chemotherapy. They may have the legal right to do that, but you really need to question whether they're not making that decision for the wrong reasons. It may be because you just told them that chemotherapy is going to make their hair fall out, and having their hair fall out changes their status in their social group. That's a decision that needs to be revisited with them when they're feeling, when they've had sort of a little more time to adjust to what you've just told them and the diagnosis and so on. And the younger adolescents need limits and direction, and that needs to be done obviously very carefully and very respectfully, but there are certain things that adolescents obviously should just be told they can't do. Our other young man, Daniel Hauser, is one of those. The judge did exactly what he should have done, which is basically to say to Daniel, I appreciate that this is what you want to do, but I can't let you do that. That's where the limit is. Now, his mother, unfortunately, cooperated with him because, quite frankly, in every case I'm aware of, and I've tracked all of them that I can find of adolescents who have refused life-saving treatment, in every one where a judge or an adult authority figure who is not a parent has said to the adolescent, you have to do this. They do it. They don't kick, they don't scream, they don't bite, they don't pull out IVs. Even if they said they would earlier, they cooperate when somebody other than a parent tells them, you have to do this. And Daniel Hauser probably would have done the same thing if his mom hadn't run away. And I suspect Daniel Hauser has done the same thing because I haven't heard more from his case. What happened with Daniel Hauser is that the district attorney in the state of Minnesota was a very smart man who went on the air nationally and pleaded with his mother to bring her back and promised that if she came back voluntarily, he would not press charges against her because she was actually facing the potential for kidnapping charges. And that was a smart decision because she fortunately engaged the rational part of her brain before she got to the Mexico border. I think she got as far as California. They ended up coming back to Minnesota, and as to the best of my knowledge, he is getting treatment for his cancer at this point in time, and probably not resisting it. And that's, in my mind, the way it should be with any adolescent who's not obviously of legal age to make decisions. It's not that this shouldn't all be done respectfully, but I think it's really important that we recognize that there are some decisions we just shouldn't let them make precisely because they really don't have the capacity to make them, or they don't use the decision-making styles they should. So I'm going to stop there and open it up for questions. How do I get this off? Anybody? Yes?
Today's paper had a report, the Supreme Court having a decision that for people who are found guilty of murder, and I think either have life or had death sentences, that they have to re-look at those again and possibly have a lesser sentence in light of past history and having done in prison. That fits with what you're...
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there are several of the researchers, Lauren Steinberg is one of them, who have done a lot of this work, have increasingly been interacting with the criminal justice system. So I think a lot of this data is actually becoming more aware to legal scholars as well as judges and attorneys, so that we will probably start to see some movement, certainly with juvenile offenders in terms of the way courts think about them. And the model you sort of have mentioned, which is, when they get to a certain age, you revisit their sentence if it's a long one and actually make a decision about whether it's appropriate to keep them incarcerated past, 25 or 30. Yes?
Wondering if maybe with some of the older 20s, 25, anything known about whether discussing this other data with them to say that, you're sort of predisposed to make decisions. If that might help them to kind of anticipate a bad situation that they're going to, and then when they get in that situation, understand a bit more about why they're feeling like they ought to make that bad decision and be able to decide it.
It's a good question, whether there's data that actually sharing some of this information with an adolescent or a mid-20s, 20-year-old person would actually be of benefit. And the short answer is I'm not aware of any data that's looked at that. I think it's a promising avenue for investigation. And my intuitive sense is that if you can find the right time, that probably does have the potential to make a difference for some people. And again, I think about my own experience with my adolescent kids, and the real key to having a rational discussion with them is to let them cool off and get past where that emotional brain is really engaged. Let that cool down, and then if you can engage the rational part of the brain, this sort of information actually may be useful in helping them understand that they make different sorts of decisions depending on what's going on. I sort of have on occasion jokingly said to my daughter, well, your amygdala is acting up again, which actually kind of ticks her off, but she gets what I'm saying. And she adolescents know this. They know that after they've cooled off that they were behaving a little irrationally. It doesn't mean they're necessarily happy about what you've told them, but they get it. And the real trick is to get them to that point. The hard thing is when you're not around, and it's not that they're angry, but that peer pressure is there. I really worry about adolescents in cars together, and that's a hard thing to know how to deal with, or at parties that aren't, don't have a parent present to sort of monitor activities. Around here you get adolescent parties going on boats. It makes me very nervous because you get these kids starting to jump into the water as a sort of risk-taking behavior, and somebody can't swim, but they go in because their friends are going, and you're looking at real trouble. We actually, my daughter is on the cross-country team at her high school, and last year they did a sort of a camp up at Camp Larrabee where the kids all went and swam up at a lake without any adults around, and actually we're seriously considering not doing the camp again this year because we think the risk is too high. Because there was one individual who was not a good swimmer, and my daughter shared with me that he had a pretty scary event with nobody around adult-wise to sort of intervene. So, on the one hand, you can't, you have to let adolescents learn and you have to give them some freedom, but I think the trick is to figure out what the limit should be and where things have crossed a line where it's too risky and the cost can be too high. Yes, in the back. So that's a good question. Are you talking about me? It's a great question because it's very true. And you know, the William Blake quote I said illustrated this, which is that we all know adults who seem to never get beyond that sort of adolescent mode of decision making, where most of their decisions are, you know, again, for lack of a better term, emotionally based, where they seem to have an impairment in terms of being able to engage a rational part of the brain to balance that those emotional feelings. I don't think we have a good explanation for that. There are clearly some people who do have damage, probably, and I think we know enough about human development to know that everybody develops a little differently, and there's always going to be a percentage of the population probably that that continues to have, you know, again, for lack of a better way of phrasing it, an imbalance between these two parts of the brain. And again, it's not that one is worse than the other, but you really do want that balance. I mean, you know, to go back to sort of the marketing examples, the smartest people who buy cars bring a friend with them. And the reason you do that is that you're emotionally invested in buying this car. Your friend is not. So what you're effectively doing is you're bringing a rational brain with you. And that's the role of that person. And it's a very effective strategy because ahead of time you get that friend to agree that they will not let you buy a car, that you're going to walk out without buying a car, that you can decide later that that's the car you want, but you're not going to let, that friend is not going to let you buy it today. And that's, it may be that you decide that what my rational brain wants here, whether it's an iPad or this particular red convertible, is what you want. But that's going to be a wiser decision if you've had a chance to sort of think rationally about that. And anybody who's done this knows that that's the way it works, right? If you can get out of the Apple store, some of you will go back and buy the iPad, but some of you will not. Some of you will look at the cost and decide, as much as I fell in love with that thing, it's not a good decision right now, and you won't do it. And that's actually what you want from these two parts of the brain. You want them talking to each other and engaging. And you know, I think what your comment suggests is that there actually is a lot of population variation here, even among adults. And there are going to be lots of adults who really still have a much stronger sort of emotional part of the brain than a rational part of the brain. And we also know the opposite is true, right? There are some people who have suggested, for example, that autism spectrum disorders, one way of sort of conceptualizing those is that these are often individuals who just have an overwhelmingly rational prefrontal cortex way of thinking about things, and that sort of socially engaged limbic structures are much less engaged in those individuals than they might be in the rest of us.
Last week there was a story on NPR about marijuana in adolescents. You know, with adult psychiatrists started correcting early with some type of development stage. I'm just curious if you have some thoughts on that.
Well, it's a good question because I think it's one that probably requires some people doing research on. I mean, really good research, because my bias is to agree with what NPR said this morning, which is I do think alcohol and marijuana and illicit drugs probably do impact the developing brain in important ways, and may explain some of this population variation we see, right, between decision making and adults. And so I worry about adolescents being exposed to those things. I mean, some of them also, probably alcohol more than marijuana, just exacerbate the problem in adolescents. I mean, adolescents who drink are going to take more risks than adolescents who don't. And so you're actually exacerbating the problem with the drug. They're less likely to survive, as we know from fraternity behavior. But I also worry that it impacts the brain, and I don't. I think there is already some data that suggests that shows that it does interfere with brain maturation in important ways. I've seen more related to alcohol than with marijuana, but it wouldn't surprise me if it's there for marijuana as well. Yeah.
It just makes me wonder, in Europe, when you have kids with lower drinking ages, or forced drinking ages, do we see the same things, or how much of this is like fraternity culture is not drinking,
Yeah.
binge drinking?
Yes.
You know, so I don't know how much of it is cultural, and also how much of the cultural element of disinhibition, being a drug.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know whether that's more prominent in
Yeah, and I mean, it's a good question about the cross-cultural differences, and because if you think about Europe, for example, on the one hand, they are much more inclined to let their adolescents drink, but at the same time, they're actually normalizing that behavior and in many ways teaching their adolescents to have a glass of wine with dinner, but not do these high doses, the binge drinking that you see in America, where it's appealing in part precisely because it's illicit. And by normalizing it, you may actually, it's possible actually that you reduce some of that desire of an adolescent. It's no longer this sort of illicit thing that the reward systems want badly because they can have it. But it's an interesting question.
So that you're saying you should expose your kids to wine more expensive than stimulating drinks?
Yes, the more expensive, the better. Yeah. If you can get them hooked on $1,000 bottles, then you're all set. All right, maybe one more. Yeah.
The ski slopes are an excellent laboratory, especially young males crashing down, basically seeing beyond the skill level. And invariably, it's four of them together, whooping and hollering and cheering each other on. The older people realize, I'm not good enough to do that. They don't get that.
No, actually, going to the ski slopes is a wonderful place to see this sort of illustrated, because you're absolutely right. And I mean, even my own experience, I mean, in my early 20s, I skied like an idiot. I mean, I was a tree skier and I hit trees and, I survived. But I don't ski that way anymore. I mean, I get more conservative as I get older, and it's not just simply because I'm not physically as capable. It's because it makes me nervous, and I do a cost-benefit analysis that I wasn't doing back then. But I'm watching my son do it now, and my son does it more than my daughter, which again is the male-female difference is really interesting. But if you get my son with friends, it's a whole other ballgame yet. I mean, then they're not only all doing it, but they're doing it at a level that he wouldn't do it alone. And it's very risky behavior. I mean, when you watch it, it's just like one of these.
So now that people are wearing helmets, apparently the rate of injury has not gone down.
Yeah.
And one of the theories is that the increased cases are adopted by the advertising culture, so that they seeing stars do these things that are pandemic yet, so that even though we're wearing helmets now, we're injuring ourselves with one rate.
Yeah, and I think that's right. There are some people who propose that the helmets make them feel safer, so that makes them want to. And I don't think that's what's going on. I don't think they're thinking about it that way. I think you're right that they're watching the people that for them are cool, particularly now that snowboarding is in the Olympics, and they're seeing these amazing things, and they want to be just like these guys, and so they're taking more risks. And the helmets aren't protecting them from those risks because the helmet is somewhat limited. The helmet is still protective, but overall, I think you're right that probably risky behavior has gone up as TV in particular has illustrated for them what they could be doing because they see it. And of course, we make heroes of these people because they're in the Olympics and so on. So adolescents want to be like them. Yeah.
That was fabulous, but I think I'm still going to snowboard.
Yeah.
Thank you
Well,
very, very much.
You're welcome.